Resuming debate?
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Resuming Debate podcast. With apologies, we missed an episode a couple weeks ago. There were a few things happening in Ottawa, as you may have subsequently read about. I wanted to get one more episode in before the end of the year, and I know we're a bit close to Christmas, but hopefully this will be an interesting and worthwhile conversation for you, and we'll be back with more episodes starting about midway through January once we come out of the Christmas break. So all of us are getting ready for Christmas, and normally for Christmas I get together with my extended family in some part of the world, and that's not happening this year. We're staying at home with 6 kids. It still feels like a full house regardless, but I am bringing my brother, Dr. Quentin Genuis, on. So this is a replacement for Christmas dinner, a recorded conversation on the podcast, but I think you'll find that Quentin's interesting experience and expertise on a range of issues make him an ideal guest for the podcast. So, Quentin, Merry Christmas. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, Merry Christmas. Good morning. I wanted to tell you that I had a dream about this podcast last night, actually. And in the dream that I had, in the intro section, you listed a long list of sponsors as you were introducing the show and mentioned that I might receive some free swag. So I wanted to beginning say that if that was some kind of a prophecy, I will accept any free swag that you can offer for coming on the podcast.
Okay, well, if at some point we shift our model, we can have you back and send you free swag. Quentin is a frontline emergency doctor in Vancouver's downtown east side, and he has written and he has a lot of interesting thoughts about some of the issues that I work on in Parliament, issues like the addiction crisis and euthanasia, he's really, in some ways, on the front lines of those issues as an emergency doctor in the downtown east side in Vancouver. So we have a lot of good conversations about kind of how the political and policy work I'm doing in Ottawa on those issues connects with or can be informed by the things he's learning and thinking about by interacting with people who are really on the front lines of these issues. Speaking of free swag, before we started, you had prompted me to ask you about the very formal hoodie you're wearing for our podcast here, which apparently connects with some of the work you're doing. So we'll start on that very erudite point. Yeah.
No, that's a really good note to start on. So I'm even though I prompted you, I'm going to also express gratitude for asking. So I work at St. Paul's, which, as many of your viewers and listeners will know, is the big hospital in downtown Vancouver. And a long time thing about St. Paul's, our reputation, our identity, is our relationship with the community of the downtown east side, which, again, as most people will know, is a community that has long-standing specific challenges that certainly involve addiction and relate to addiction in this time, but there's other features of that community as well. I moved to Vancouver for a fellowship year, for a residency year here, not knowing that much about St. Paul's, and I'm just so happy that I did. And my wife and I came to Vancouver partly planning to leave really after the year and just being here for a year, and we've stayed now for almost 6 years. And most of the reason that we've stayed is that I love St. Paul's. I love my patients, especially my patients from the downtown east side, and especially those people who have significant challenges involving addiction. And it's an honor and a pleasure for me to know them, to witness their courage and their perseverance. And hopefully, even in the space of that emerge doc patient, very pressured interaction in some ways, to not just offer them medical services, but to care for them and to have real personal goods and even the goods of friendship and mutual care arise. And one thing that I always think about that is this sweatshirt that I'm now wearing. And so this is just a good St. Paul story that tells you something about the kind of thing that happens in our hospital on many days. So I was working with a medical student. So medicine, as you know, is sort of an apprenticeship model for senior learners. So as an emerge doc at an academic center, most shifts I have some level of learner with me, and they often go and assess patients by themselves, and then I go back and assess the patient with them. And so there was a patient middle of the night who came in triage, and the triage note said, fell down, cut on head or something. And the med student was very excited. Med students love suturing. So I sent her to go and stitch up this forehead. So the med student went and stitched up the forehead, and then she came back. She's high-fiving everyone, very excited, put in some stitches. And then I asked her, why did he have a cut on his forehead? And she said, oh, I think he had an overdose or something. And so I said, oh, let's go ask him about that piece of the puzzle. And so we went and we saw this patient who was lying in a stretcher at St. Paul's in a sweater, this sweater actually, to ruin my punchline, but he was wearing this oversized sweater with this big ugly skull on the front, and his sweater was just soaking wet, and he was lying on this stretcher, and he was on the nod, which is a term that we use to describe the particular kind of drowsiness that people have when they're intoxicated on opioids, that kind of head nodding, trying to stay awake. And so I, from across the room, said, this gentleman is intoxicated on opioids, and said to the medical student, absolutely, we should deal with the cut on his forehead. But the primary thing that's going to affect his health in the long term is we should ask him about what happened. And so the first thing he said when I asked him about it was, he said, I'm still pretty out of it right now, but when I wake up, I'm going to be devastated. And I didn't use for about 6 months, and things were going really well. And he was part of a 12-step program, and some things had happened in his life, and he had relapsed, is the language that he used, the night before. And he hadn't had a dangerous overdose, but had, collapsed after smoking something and had just laid in a puddle in downtown Vancouver on the sidewalk for hours and hours and hours until a bystander woke him up. And then he sort of described himself as sort of dragging his way to the hospital. And he said, repeatedly that he was just devastated. He didn't know what he was going to do come the morning, and he didn't know if he could start again in terms of the journey of recovery. And again, it was a pleasure for me to be able to sit there with him and to offer him the meagerness of my own presence, of my encouragement, to say things about hope for him. And he found that to be very significant. And I repeatedly asked him, can you tell me something we can do for you to show you kindness or hospitality? And he finally said, I hate this sweater with a skull on the front that I got at a shelter. Can you give me a new jacket? And at St. Paul's, we often have a cupboard where we give patients like things that people have donated, but we were out of them. So I went and fetched him my own coat. And I don't usually tell people if I give them my clothes, but I forgot that my keys were in the pocket of it. So I gave it to him. And then I was like, oh man. So I ran back before he left, and I was like, sorry. And I was like fishing through this thing that he was wearing. And he's like a lot of a bigger guy than me. And I was reaching in, and anyway, so I found my keys, and then he said, I would really like to give you something in return. Can I give you my sweater? And he was standing there holding his this sweater, which was soaking wet and pretty dirty, but he intended it as a gift, and I received it as a gift. And so I wear this sweater all the time when I work, when I write, sometimes when I teach about addiction, depending on the dress code. As you can see, it's got this big skull on it, says till death. It wouldn't be my first fashion choice, but it makes me think about my own vocation in terms of not just, again, medical services, but hopefully the goods of friendship, mutual respect, mutual care between myself and my patients. And and I wear it as a way of thinking about him and praying for him.
That's a phenomenal story. Yeah, thanks for sharing it. It's a good jumping off point to dig into something you said a bit earlier, which is you talked about loving the community and loving your patients. I think there's a lot of emphasis maybe put on ideas of professional detachment that I think a lot of people's expectation would be that you're kind of like as an emergency doctor, you're kind of like a high performance athlete. You kind of go in there and you do the things, and then you're done at the end of your shift. But you've just described, and I know from our previous conversations, you kind of have this different ethos around your relationship to your job, as not being one of like performing a function and being otherwise professionally detached, but of a kind of all-encompassing personal, mental, emotional, spiritual engagement with the people you're interacting with. Tell us a bit about that, and if that brings with it a set of challenges as well when you're trying to kind of live life apart from that world.
Yeah, I think there are ways, maybe to start on the opposite end. I think there are ways where a certain kind of a professional distance, or like something not a performance mentality but adjacent to that, can be good for patients. And so I don't want to come across as saying that I don't think there aren't kinds of distance that can be appropriate. I was thinking about this the other day. We have patients very frequently who come into not very frequently, but probably once a month, I see someone who says, I think I have a bug in my ear. And up until last week, 0% of those patients actually had a bug in their ear. And then last year, I saw this elderly gentleman who truly had a bug in his ear that I had to, and the patient was saying to me, because one of his family members was in the room, this is the grossest thing I can imagine. How can you do that and just be chit-chatting? And I said to him, like, oh, this kind of thing is a normal Tuesday for me. And in that sense, I think there is a way that physicians who work in certain roles do maybe have a kind of set apartness, which maybe has to do with their willingness to put up with certain kinds of craziness that most people wouldn't want to put up with. And in that sense, in that narrow sense, I'm okay to saying that there might be a kind of distance or differentness that can mark a vocation like mine. But aside from that, and I say this to learners all the time because I'm very involved in medical education, I think the professional distance model is truly bad for everyone. I believe, as part of my anthropology, that there's something beautiful as a part of human beings, that we have the capacity to relate to each other powerfully, and that the suffering of other persons moves us, and the grief of other persons grieves us, and that is good and beautiful, and at the heart of communities of justice and peace and mutual respect is this capacity to relate to one another, to empathize with one another. So first and foremost, it's bad for our patients if you have physicians who aspire to be unmoved, uncaring, uninvolved. And I think about this when I see the many patients I see who tragically die very young with issues related to addictions and overdoses. From my perspective, it would be disrespectful and offensive to witness those things and be coolly, professionally distant. That's not what they want from me. That's not what their families and our communities should want from physicians or nurses who work in those environments. What I say to my learners, though, is that aspiring to cool distance isn't just bad for patients, it's bad for us. It's bad for our own emotional lives, it's bad for our own relationships, because aspiring to this cold, emotionless detachment from the lives of our patients makes us unfeeling, and it burns us out. And I'm increasingly convinced that when people, if you take a poll of my colleagues and say, are you burnt out? Most people I work with would say yes. A large majority of people I work with would say yes. And I've become increasingly convinced that the problem of burnout is not a problem of too much compassion or too much empathy. The problem is of people who've been formed in a system that says that's essentially repressive, that says you have to turn it off, you have to not relate, you have to find some professional way to stand at a distance and get harder. And the success in that project is much worse than failure. Finding yourself unable to feel the bad things then also produces a situation where you're unable to feel the good things. And my alternative, which is much preferred, is the alternative of drawing close to patients, again, with certain professional lines like confidentiality and having a certain role, which are obviously good things. But I believe it's much, much better to grieve with those who we grieve, to mourn with those who mourn, to come close to people And in doing so, you realize the beauty of those persons. And when you stand at a distance and try not to see them as persons and just to see them as bodies, you actually shut yourself off from the very thing that will sustain your vocation. And that's, if I can tell one more Downtown East Side story, because it's just one of my favorite stories from like early in my career at St. Paul's. I was working in the fast track area of St. Paul's, and I make jokes about fast track all the time. We actually changed the name because we realized that the word fast track was misleading. But on paper, it's supposed to be for quick, simple issues, and it almost never is. But there was someone who came to triage at St. Paul's who had glass in his foot, and the triage nurse called me on the phone and said, this patient has a violence flag on his chart, and he was very verbally aggressive and swearing to staff at triage, and we almost escorted him out with security, but would you be willing to take a look at his foot? And I said, of course. And so when I went to see him, he was certainly, as advertised when I first went to the waiting room, but I got him in a stretcher and chatted to him, and he sort of settled down a bit. And then as I was sort of picking a shard of glass or two out of his foot, I asked him how he ended up with glass in his foot. And he said to me, this is what he said. He said, I used to be homeless. I used to have a severe addiction to down, which is what people call fentanyl and similar opioids. And he said, for months, I just walked up and down Hastings looking for my next hit. And for a while, I didn't even have shoes. I just walked in bare feet, and my feet were so sore and they hurt so bad. But I didn't even take the time to go to a shelter because my whole life was about finding my next hit of down. And he said, things are better now. I've been sober for a certain amount of time, and I've got a room at an SRO, and I've got a job. And he said, at this job where I got, they gave me 2 pairs of shoes. They gave me a pair of like sturdy work boots for his work at a warehouse, and they gave me a pair of sneakers for home. And on the day when he came to St. Paul's, he said, I was walking through the Downtown East Side to home, and I saw a guy sitting on the curb, and he didn't have any shoes. And I thought to myself, how can I have 2 pairs of shoes when that man has none? And he took off his work boots and he put them on the feet of this stranger. And then he tried to walk home in bare feet and got a foot full of glass. And then notably, he came to St. Paul's and he was really mean to the triage nurse and then, was swearing at everyone. And anyways, that kind of story for me just like encapsulates why we should draw close to other persons, at knowing that there will be a cost to ourselves, that we will be wounded and grieved by the suffering that we take into our lives from these vocations. But those wounds and scars and griefs are good things. We should aspire to the right kind of woundedness. And when we draw close, we will find ourselves just moved, inspired by our patients.
Right. Yeah, that's a great story, and that's sort of fascinating argument you're making. I think probably a fairly unconventional argument that I guess intuitively I would think that there's probably points of pain and challenge either way. Like if you engage emotionally, you are going to feel with what others are feeling. If you disengage emotionally, that is, I think what you're describing is that kind of deadens your own humanity.
Yeah.
And
have you ever read the Four Quartets?
No.
T.S. Eliot has a great line, and he's not talking about this phenomenon, but he has a line in the Four Quartets where he says, we only live, only suspire, consumed by either fire or fire. And he, in that section, is contrasting 2 views of how to live as a human being. And I often use this idea of being consumed by either fire or fire when I describe to learners or to medical professionals what I think is what it means to be part of a caring vocation, and specifically the vocation at a place like St. Paul's, in that if you think you can do something like this and not suffer, that's naive. And oftentimes in professional settings, what people offer up is like box breathing or mindfulness, which are not bad things in themselves, but they're like toothpicks in a hurricane when you encounter horrible, horrible tragedies that we do all the time. And so we shouldn't aspire to no suffering. But then this idea of fire or fire to me suggests that depending on how we approach those things, we may have some choice of what kind of suffering we take in based on these vocations. And for me, the dehumanizing suffering of deadening and jadedness and uncaring, inability to recognize patients as persons just like yourself, that is far worse than the grief, the scars, the wounds, the sorrow of becoming softer. And my experience and my vocation is that I, rather than becoming harder, have become much softer, in some ways more emotional, like not, I don't think in a way that detracts from care of patients, in front of patients, but in my own life, becoming softer, and that changes you for sure. But at the same time, I am every day that I go to work, I'm excited to go to work. I love going to work. I sometimes think about how I'm still pretty young in my career, but I'm already grieving, like, oh man, I've already worked 5 years. I'm already 15% of the way through my career. I can't believe it's going so fast. Like, I love my work. I get more joy in it than I can say.
So when you're making your pitch about, it's either fire or fire to new learners, I mean, it sounds a bit like that famous ad for a South Pole exhibition, where it's going to be rough, it's going to be painful, limited chance of survival. Do you get that same response where people say, I'm in for the challenge, or do you get a lot of people who say, like, man, now that I see a little bit of what this is about, I'm going to go, I'm going to go find the most, I'm going to find a way of living my medical vocation that's far away from the greatest need and that's safe and comfortable.
I think that a place like St. Paul's is a place that many people come and they don't want to be there, and many learners come, and I'm really grateful to say, like, I work with many colleagues, doctors and nurses who would see things, I think, in an overlapping way. Maybe the language they would use is different, but who see it vocationally and who aspire not to this unfeelingness. And so that creates a culture that in many ways has formed me and is beautiful. And there are people who come and who hear that pitch or see that pitch and say that is not for me. And they want to go. And there are many places in medicine where that are structured such that you can have this very detached worldview and be effective on a day-to-day basis. And from my perspective, those roles are probably dehumanizing and depersonalizing over time. But I'll put that argument on the shelf for now, and just say we then encounter some learners who come and who catch the bug at St. Paul's, and you watch them interact with patients and see that they aspire to care for them, to connect with them, not just to speak, but also to listen, not just to inform, but to be informed, to be changed. And then we try to encourage those people to stay.
Yeah. So one of the things that's actually, I was just going to make a quick comment on this whole area of discussion, which is, like, I think there's a certain parallel in political work, in that, I mean, our primary vocation isn't kind of the frontline patient care type of work. It's making policy decisions that will shape the direction of our country. But I certainly have had the kinds of interactions, especially in my human rights work, where I'm interacting with people that have been victims of gross human rights abuses, or even some situations where, as part of a visiting foreign delegation, there are people that are involved in a regime that is responsible for human rights abuses. And I also believe that it's good to be emotionally engaged in those situations, to feel the things that are going on, rather than to just try to focus on the kind of form and structure of what's expected of you, and ignore the kind of deeper moral and sort of emotion shaping content of that. So I think that there's probably a lot of different vocations where this question of loving engagement versus a certain kind of professional detachment plays out. Can you talk a little bit about like you're a frontline emergency doctor. You're also someone who reads and writes about medical ethics. You have a master's in theology. I think it's probably evident for people just listening to the start of this conversation that you're someone who's kind of engaged in the intellectual life of the mind. How does that connect to your frontline work? How is that relevant to the conversations you have with someone who has glass in their foot?
I think from my perspective, it informs everything that I do. There's a scholar who I studied with at St. Andrews, which is where I did my master's degree, as you know, who somewhere I've tried to track down this quote several times and I've never been able to, but I swear somewhere on his blog, he said that doing philosophy and theology is talking about things that seem irrelevant only until you realize that they determine almost everything else. Talking about categories that when you begin hearing about them, something like anthropology, for example, in medicine, what does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to be a person? I think if I started talking about anthropology to many of my colleagues at grand rounds or something, their short attention span emerged, doc brains would turn off and they would say, anthropology, not relevant to my chest pain patients. But the goal of lots of the teaching that I do is to pull them along enough, because from my perspective, that actually determines almost everything about the way we approach our chest pain patients, although it takes a little bit of time to get there and to flesh out those connections. And so I think one bias that many people have in medicine and the way that people in medical professions are trained is that we practice this thing called evidence-based medicine, that there can be such thing as a totally value-free, amoral place where we just know everything there is to be known about what good health outcomes are and how to produce them. And then we are just these sort of technicians who flush out or connect the evidence to individual persons. But certainly medical practice in the emergency department, most patients I see, all patients I see, have concerns and needs that cannot be fleshed out via the evidence-based method. And one of the sobering things about working in emergency medicine, for example, is how many patients come to the emergency department with problems that are rooted in despair, in social isolation, in loneliness, in addiction, in fear, not anxiety in a narrow medical sense, but people who are afraid of various things that are not narrow medical problems. And what we say about health for those people, what we say about what is the good for this person, that is inherently a moral, ethical question. And you can't answer those questions, what is the good, unless you answer the question, what is a human being? What is a human person? What is human nature? And for me, I have a theological anthropology, which means if you want to answer the question, what is a human being? You need to answer the question, where are we coming from and where are we going? And for me, the ultimate answer at either ends of that spectrum, where we come from, where we're going, is this thing that I call God. And that everyone believes in implicitly or explicitly, that relates to their belief about the nature of ultimate reality, whether they call that ultimate reality God or not. And so for me, tracking back what we say about ultimate reality connects to what we do for patients. And just to use one example, I think an easy example is moral language like human rights or human dignity. These are ideas that in our environment, everyone would agree, or most everyone would agree, are commitments that we share in common, that we believe that everyone has these things called human rights that we are moral commitments that we hope are inviolable, that no one violates. And we agree, I think most people, we have a commitment that says all human persons we interact with are deserving of respect because they have something called dignity. But in our context, those are commitments that are in search of a rationale, most people believe them, but couldn't articulate a rationale for why. And even the United Nations Council that sort of that produced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in one of their really foundational documents, they said, this declaration works really well when you just assert it as a thing in itself, because we could all agree that it's right, but all the philosophers who worked on it couldn't agree on why. But pragmatically, that actually makes those commitments potentially erodable. That's not a good word, but you know what I mean? It makes them unstable in society if everyone is asserting these commitments, but doesn't have a thick moral rationale. Why does every person matter? Why is human dignity so significant? Why should we empty ourselves in a vocation like yours or mine? Why should we empty ourselves on behalf of the other? That why is not a scientific question. It's not a question that's subject to evidence. That's a philosophical and a theological question. And if I can add one final thing to my answer to our prior conversation, it is that when I talk to people about fire or fire, I think I can sometimes come across as you just have to empty yourself as this moral commitment. And that can sometimes sound like very cold comfort to people who are struggling to do that, but feel like they don't have the resources. And I do think to engage in vocations like this, you need to yourself be grounded in thick moral spaces that inform the work that you do. And so for me, that's, thick social, community, and religious spaces that can give resources, not only for the life of the mind, but for the life of the body, the life of my whole person, that enables me again to engage in these vocations.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So let's talk about that in the context of the reality of the very pluralistic society that we live in, right? So you've got, and I think it's maybe interesting to observe that we are seeing escalating attacks on Catholic healthcare delivery specifically, right? In Parliament, you have the NDP directly, even on issues that are not federal jurisdiction, they're provincial jurisdiction in Alberta, but attacking Catholic healthcare delivery. And I think it's good to understand in the context of what you just described that that many people that are involved in these systems, they are motivated to care of others from a kind of robust philosophical theological system, and there may be others who draw motivation from other places and other environments, but this has been the history of healthcare in this country, and has been a key part in its sort of historic build up. But now your institution, Catholic institutions across the country, they're providing healthcare in large numbers to people who come from a wide variety of different worldviews. So how does kind of your view of the human person interact with a patient who doesn't share that and can't understand or communicate on the same ground?
Yeah, and I'll say just maybe this is a plug for my own context. So I, like you said, I work at St. Paul's under the umbrella of Providence Health, which is a Catholic health affiliate here in Vancouver. And one of the things that I have found really beautiful about the identity of St. Paul's, and again, I didn't come to St. Paul's because it was St. Paul's or because of its that it was a Catholic hospital. I came here for an educational program kind of by accident, and then I discovered something that was really beautiful that has compelled me to stay. But I actually find the environment of St. Paul's actually can produce a beautiful kind of pluralism. And I could tell you physicians who I work with who come from all kinds of different religious backgrounds and traditions, but who feel at home in a Catholic setting because it isn't a setting that says you have to just put on your professional hat and just ignore all of your other personal commitments. But it is a space that doesn't say you have to be a Catholic to engage in this space, but is open and even nurturing to the ways that people bring their own deep commitments to work. And so even I'm not a Catholic Christian myself, but I feel very much part of the family at Providence, no less so not being a Catholic. And I work with many people in leadership who have strong Catholic faith, and I love working with them. And I think we have mutual respect and admiration. And so that's just my little Providence Healthcare plug. I will say that most patients, of course, most of my staff members, but especially most of my patients that I work with, don't share my worldview or my specific faith commitments. But to go back to something I said at the beginning, I think because of my beliefs about common human nature, which again are rooted in my particular worldview, but is a belief that I have about the nature of all persons, it means that my faith compels me to treat that person in a certain kind of way, with courtesy, with respect, with care, and to aspire to treat them with love. And the standard of love is a very high standard that I try and fail to meet all the time. But my faith says to me that I can't just do this like narrow little thing, that even for the patient with the just ankle sprain or the tooth pain, that I should aspire to offer them a gift of care. And sometimes it's just an ankle sprain, and I ask them, is there any way that can help you? And no, they're fine. They're just there for an ankle sprain, and that's wonderful. But then my responsibility to them is to offer them something beyond that, if and when they need it, and if and when I can identify it. And so I don't think there's any tension, contradiction between my particular worldview and caring for those patients. And I work with, I know some Muslim physicians very well, some Jewish physicians very well, who would share that view, that their particular faith is not an impediment to them caring for people with different worldviews. It actually is an incredible asset that allows them, that informs their ability to care for their patients. So
and just to drill on that, you find that other non-Catholic Christians, people of other faiths, appreciate that Catholic environment because it, even if their own faith or intellectual tradition is different, they're in an environment where the reality of the kind of robust intellectual or theological backgrounds people bring with them is recognized and appreciated instead of pushed outside.
Yeah, so I even know someone who's a clinical ethicist, who's a very committed practicing Jewish person, who wants to live out west and who only would be able to work in Providence, because this is a person who brings her faith tradition to her work on a day-to-day basis. And so many other health authorities would say, no, if you want to be a clinical ethicist, you just need to be like, again, they present being an ethicist as if you could be an objective ethicist, as if you could stand from some position that's free of any worldview, free of any moral commitments, and somehow was rooted in science, and which we know that everyone has a worldview, everyone has a particular view of the good that's informed not just by objective ways of knowing, but is also informed by other ways of knowing. But she, as someone who's not part of the Christian tradition at all, recognizes a Catholic healthcare space as a space that says, come here with your particular commitments and worldview, and be engaged in a thick space of dialogue where we see that part of you as coming to the table because that's part of you. That's part of your expertise. That's part of your perspective. And we have something to learn from you and together with you. And so both as a person of faith, but also someone like that, the life of her mind, you can understand why coming to a space like Providence is appealing. You can bring your whole self. So, yeah.
So let's talk a bit about addiction, because this has been really good. But I wanted to dig into the addiction piece specifically. You're on the front lines of a national addiction crisis. What do people, policymakers in Ottawa, but also our listeners across the country, need to know about the addiction crisis and what we can do to confront it, that come from your experience at this kind of epicenter of the challenge?
Yeah, the first thing that I'll say that I always feel compelled to say is what a tragedy it is. And despite all of the efforts to raise awareness and to talk about it, from my perspective, from the work that I do, this is still under-recognized, underappreciated, under-grieved. What a utter tragedy this is. And there's a line from Steinbeck, book, Grapes of Wrath, where he talks about a very different tragedy, but he says there's a sorrow here that weeping cannot symbolize. There's a crime here that goes beyond denunciation. There's a failure here that topples all of our successes. And I work on the first floor, the ground floor of a hospital that is, a center of excellence for a variety of things. We do so many amazing, fancy procedures, and as a hospital that's filled with wonderful people. And I come to work and I see young people dying of overdoses, and I feel in my bones that there's an utter failure here that topples all of our successes. And I recently saw a young man who came in post cardiac arrest, younger than me, who comes from a family not so different from ours, who came out to Vancouver from his home in Ontario, and who was in Vancouver for not too long and went to a party and used something he thought was something else and died of a opioid overdose. And I called his mother to tell her that her son had died in our department. And there was a bit of a language barrier there, and I was trying to tell her in a soft and gentle way, but I found myself having to repeat on the phone to her because she wasn't understanding what I was saying. He died. He died. And then after a few seconds, she realized, and I heard her drop the phone on the floor and was just crying in the background. And she was shouting, "How could you let this happen? How could you let this happen?" And then her son, one of her other sons, picked up the phone and was angry. Who's this person on the phone who made his mom cry? And then I told him that his brother had died, and he couldn't believe it. And then, I was asking about why, and I said I don't know, but probably it was from an overdose. And all of the things that we say, and all of the things on the newspaper, those things can't capture the toll, the fracturing of human communities, the tragedies within families of the addictions crisis. And that's the first thing I want to say about it. The second thing I want to say about it is to point beyond both of our vocations and to say that addiction is not a problem that can be fixed by medicine. It's also not a narrow problem that can be fixed by policy. And medical care for people with addictions is vital. It is good. But we harm people when we say it's a narrow medical problem, just go talk to your doctor. And similarly, when people, no offense to any of your political listeners, but when people become over political and they just say, we just need the right policy and then this problem will go away. We desperately need good policy that has a high, hopeful view for recovery for people with addiction, and also promotes their safety as part of the safety of their communities. But if anyone thinks that we're just the right legislation away from solving this problem, that's just an attitude that lets you off the hook from your responsibility to your own family members who struggle from addiction, your own neighbors, the people in your own communities. Addiction is a belonging problem. It's a problem that is rampant in our society in many ways because our society is isolated. We have so few thick social spaces that produce purpose and meaning and belonging for persons. And as such, it's so easy for people to be drawn to harmful attachments and forms of seeking belonging. So addiction is a problem that requires care and love and thick social moral spaces to care for persons. And so, I'd want to say good things about what good medicine does and good policy does too. But my headline is, this is a devastating problem, and the solution is not easy, and casts into question the whole way our society views the person.
Okay.
So that's a lot.
Yeah. No. So I guess let's segment out your comments into the three parts then. So there's the core belonging problem that you've identified, and it sounds like you're saying that focusing only on the medical or on the political kind of allows individuals to point to somebody else, but recognizing this as a belonging problem calls for action by everyone everywhere. So there's that belonging problem you've identified, but I also want to talk about what good medical care looks like and good policy looks like in response to these things. So why don't I'll prod you to offer some ideas or solutions in each of those three areas.
Yeah, so I think maybe I'll just to maybe talk a little bit about the medical. So one thing I think is really important to identify, there's this philosopher, this 20th century philosopher named Ivan Illich, who wrote a book called Medical Nemesis. That's a really interesting read for any of your philosophically inclined listeners. But he coins this term that I think is really helpful, that he calls social iatrogenesis. And I know that's a mouthful, but basically social iatrogenesis is the way that the medical apparatus in our time harms people by suggesting that whole person problems, human problems, are narrow medical problems. And there's actually a way that this has led to the opioid crisis, because medicine in the 19th, 20th century said that the problem of suffering, which is an existential problem, a universal existential human problem, is actually the problem of pain. And that is actually a medical problem. And so our society pivoted from seeing suffering as primarily this mystery that should prompt thick community response to the person who's suffering, to instead saying pain is a problem that needs to be killed. Pain killing became this thing that moved onto the narrow ground of the doctor, and that positioned patients in a more passive way. Instead of saying, how do I respond to suffering, and what do I do that promotes the agency of the person in their community, it says, I'm the consumer or the victim who comes to the physician who has an obligation to kill my pain, to solve the problem of my pain with the right technology. And that led in the 20th century to this, race of research to produce more and more effective and strong painkillers. That was not in itself bad, to produce, new medicines that can be used in beautiful ways. But anyone who knows, the history of the opioid crisis knows that viewing of pain as a problem to be solved at all costs has produced far more suffering through the way that it led to the opioid crisis. But we're making a similar.
Yeah. So maybe just to describe that, because I think some people will have seen the documentary I produced, Elite Addiction, and various books have been written. But basically, the Sackler family that owned Purdue Pharma, that was the primary actor in causing the opioid crisis. They were selling opioids as the all-purpose solution to pain, and there was a lot of lies that were told in the process of marketing this, and this. So the idea of this wonder pill as the all-purpose solution to pain. Actually, this is what substantially caused the opioid crisis, and I wonder if that history challenges your belonging thesis a little bit, in that, like, there were a lot of people who probably didn't have any problems with belonging or community, who just had back pain, took a pill, and then addiction resulted.
Yeah, and I would say the belonging problem is maybe a headline that requires significant nuancing, and there's many different stories that lead people to addiction, and certainly the common story, especially in those early waves, of the person who broke their knee and never had a history of significant addiction before, and then ended up trapped in this cycle that was a surprise to them, of dependence and ultimately addiction. I think defining belonging or ordering a certain way would fit those stories as well. But I agree, it certainly requires some nuancing. But just to continue on my trajectory.
Yeah, sorry. No,
it's okay. I think we're doing a similar thing with opioid crisis, with addictions in general now, is we are harming people. We're producing social iatrogenesis by saying addiction is a medical problem. And instead of seeing addiction as a whole person problem that relates to the mind, that relates to love and order and rhythm and habit and these universal human phenomena, with medical people with good intentions, not with ill intentions, have said the way to treat people respectfully and not stigmatize them or whatever is to say, this is just a narrow medical problem. And then we'll bring it onto our turf, and then it will be a problem that can be solved via medical technology and medications. One thing I believe very strongly is that move is bad for everyone. It's bad for medical people because it positions us in a way that is ultimately, instead of saying we have a narrow piece of whole person care that we should seek to do well, it sets us up as doing more than we can do. And then we find ourselves distressed by all the things we can't do, like the ability to offer longstanding friendship and accountability to persons that is beyond what we can do as physicians in that role. It's bad for people with addiction because it neutralizes the ability of their groups of friends, their community centers, their churches, their synagogues, the places where they belong. It tells those places that they have nothing to do with the journey of recovery. And then it's bad for all kinds of thick cultural spaces because it says that, addiction just exists in this small area, and the rest of you, your families, your friends, whatever the places of belonging you exist in, don't have a role to play. So to speak then about social spaces, I think that most stories, and I've read now just dozens and dozens and dozens of memoirs of addiction, most stories of recovery are stories that relate very deeply to the story of the person. It's not just the recovery of their autonomous brain from this disease it has. Their story of recovery involves friendship and care and love and hope and family often. And it exists within, again, these social spaces of respect, empathy, development of agency. And so this is why I say this is an issue that should compel all of us to look at ourselves and ask what's our responsibility to care for our own neighbors. And this is why 12-step programs, although there's pros and cons to 12-step programs, why 12-step programs, especially for alcohol, are so effective is they are spaces that offer meaningful friendship and care to persons who have addictions. I continue to believe more and more that at the heart of the power of those things is simply the power of robust friendship to be able to displace addiction. You don't need to be a doctor or a politician or anyone to produce those goods. In fact, my vocation actually inhibits me in some ways from production of robust friendships over time. So anyway.
So on this distinction between a medical problem versus a whole person problem, and I do want to come back to the policy stuff, but just on this distinction, because I think it's important to understand. One thing I think that's rightly really important to a lot of people in talking about this space is to be non-judgmental. That is to speak with love and affirmation towards those who are struggling with addiction, and some might worry that describing this as a person problem instead of a medical problem risks opening up more space in the conversation for things that sound judgmental. And it's clear from this whole conversation that you're someone who has great love and empathy and wants to journey with your patients and not judge them. But how do you think we can shape a discourse that recognizes the whole person context without being judgmental?
I think that for me, the crux of this point of the conversation is around this term culpability. So I think there's maybe what people would think of as a more old school view of addiction, which is what you might call a choice model, which says people who developed addictions made that choice. Therefore, we have less responsibility to help them. They made their bed, they can lie in it. And that is, in my opinion, a view that I find inadequately respectful of the person. Interestingly, that view accepts this premise that there's a law of proportion between culpability and care. How much we care for someone for a problem is proportional to how culpable they are for that problem. And the disease model of addiction was largely driven by people who wanted to reject the choice model, but they actually still accepted this same proportion, this same rule that how much we care for someone is proportional to how culpable they are. Those people with the disease model admirably wanted so badly to care for people with addiction, and I love them for that. But because they still accepted this proportion, they said the way to care is then to advance a model which dogmatically asserts non-culpability across the board as a blanket for all people who have addiction, that it's a problem. And I know people who would say this, that addiction by definition is a non-culpable problem. That is well motivated, but it actually fails to look closely at the person. And most people I know who have severe addictions, if you ask them, tell me how you developed addiction, it's a complicated causal process where to say no choices they made related at all, they're by definition non-culpable, actually just knocks the edges off the nuance of their story. And so one move that's critically important to me is to say, we should just smash any sense of association between culpability and care. Rather, we should be agnostic about culpability and say, do not judge, but say we should care for the other because they are a person. And that is enough reason to expend our lives caring for our neighbors. And this is true in other areas of medicine. And this is why I'm not a disease model person. There are narrow points of analogy between addiction and disease. So, for example, a heart attack. We know that, some of the risk factors that lead to heart attacks relate to choices people make. Diet, exercise, smoking, for example. We know that other risk factors that lead to heart attack do not relate by anyone's measure to choice, like, your particular coronary artery anatomy, for example. When I see a patient who comes into the emergency department with a heart attack, I ask about all of those factors. But it would be ridiculous for me to say to a patient, you are 20% culpable for your heart attack and you are 80% culpable for your heart attack. Both because it'd be impossible for me to actually unwind all the forms of causality in such a complex situation. But more importantly, because that would obviously be bizarre in such a way that it inhibited the trust between me and my patients. My job is to say, you're a person with a heart attack and I have a responsibility to care for you. And yes, I should ask you about smoking as a way of promoting your future health. So I can tell you to stop smoking to avoid the next one or to reduce your future risk. For me, there's a meaningful point of analogy between that and my patient with addiction. That it is not my job to judge culpability at all. It is my job to care for them because they are a person and they're inherently deserving of my respect. And thick spaces of recovery will look into the causality, the factors that don't relate to their agency, the factors that do relate to the choices that they made, not as a way of making the person feel ashamed or worse about themselves, but as a way of promoting healing and growth. And in my view, one significant weakness of the disease model is that it actually turns our eyes away from those kinds of conversations by just saying this person is the passive victim of a brain disease.
Well, that's really fascinating, and we could probably take that in lots of different directions. And as we normally do when we get together in person at Christmas time, we could probably talk about this for 3 or 4 hours. Just to stick within roughly our normal time parameters, I think what you're talking about in terms of agency and complexity probably has some relevance to the policy space. But just to make it very explicit, I mean, in Vancouver, we're seeing the results of a particular policy approach, which really emphasizes, the so-called safe supply experiment, and like a very different approach to these dangerous substances than we're seeing even in other parts of the country. What are your reflections on that experience and on some of the policy debates, for instance, between an emphasis on treatment and recovery versus the kind of more predominant Vancouver model? What do you recommend at a policy level, and how is your experience being on the front lines kind of informing your thoughts on what we as policymakers should be doing?
Yeah, just to take one step back for a minute, I think one of the big things I would say about the policy is I often hear there being a tension in the way people talk about policy between people who, on one hand, speak in a way that really cares for people with severe addiction. And those often end up being the people who promote, the harm reduction to the nth degree model, the safe supply model, the decriminalization models. And then you have other people on the other end who talk a lot about community safety and crime and those kinds of things, who end up being more on the end of other kinds of approaches, maybe a more treatment-based approach. I don't want to fall myself into either of those camps. And sometimes I feel in those debates an implicit argument that says either you care about these persons with severe addictions or you care about community safety, as if the good for the individual, these vulnerable individuals, is opposed to or in tension with the good of communities. And so myself, especially in my own vocation, I'm so interested in caring for the good of these persons. What I often hear in Vancouver, underneath a lot of the safe supply policy, is people who have inadequate hope for meaningful healing and recovery from addiction. And for them, it is good enough to clear the bar of making a severe addiction a little bit safer. And I hope you will hear me that I deeply care about making persons safer in the short term. And anything that reduces the risk of an overdose today is compelling to me to some degree because I care about those persons. But I do think that, for example, a safe supply policy is inadequately hopeful for meaningful recovery of persons from addiction. And so instead of merely investing in clearing the bar of making a horrible form of suffering slightly less dangerous today, we should look at the person and we should invest in believing that person can find meaningful hope and recovery and freedom. And I know people who have, had the severest of addictions who, many people would think casually would be beyond hope, who have found hope and healing because someone gave them a pair of socks, or because their mom came and found them in the downtown east side and brought them home and fought for them through a long journey of recovery. And so I would encourage policy people, don't accept a tension between, or don't accept a necessary tension between the individual community. Believe that the way to produce communities of peace and justice is to help people who are suffering find recovery in thick social spaces, and never accept a hopeless view that persons with addiction will always have those addictions and will never get better. So it's enough to reduce the risk a little bit. Invest in things that offer them hope. I see people at St. Paul's every single day who come in with overdoses or intoxication, who are asking for a recovery bed and for a detox bed, and for whom there isn't one available. And those patients, if they're left on the street always waiting for one that's available 12 days from now, it's very challenging for them to make those appointments. And then they just get put off and put off and put off for a long period of time. So if you ask me to be part of making a policy, the number one thing that I would say is invest in available spaces that promote real recovery. And as much as you can, from a policy perspective, partner as a government with communities and groups that can do things that, that politicians, doctors can't do, which is mentor, gather in basements and community centers week after week after week after week after week, and tell your stories and weep together. And invest in those spaces and in the people who are doing those things.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So in terms of how we talk about it, and I think there are people on the sort of treatment and recovery side who are talking about both community safety and the well-being of those who are struggling with addictions. I guess one point coming out of this conversation for me is the problem of addiction relating to atomization and a lack of belonging, and actually the way we're sometimes talking about addiction reflects that same disconnect between the good of the community and the individual, and that we should understand that there is an alignment between the well-being of communities and the individuals within them, and that helping promote treatment and recovery for the good of those struggling with addictions. There's a unity between their good and the good of the communities that they're a part of. So, we've talked a lot about deeper ideas and some intellectual and moral abstractions, but for people that want a real concrete takeaway, the idea that you would be able to have immediately available treatment and detox spaces for a patient who comes into St. Paul's Emerge and says, I'm ready for treatment, and that you are able to say, good, here's here's a taxi chit, here's the address, walk in there, tell them we sent whatever, and you got your space. That versus saying, oh, sorry, you might be ready now, but we're not ready for you yet. We'll put you on a list, and who knows where their life goes in the intervening time. So your ability to make a effective referral, to coin a phrase, an immediate referral to a treatment and detox space that's available would be a game changer. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but is that what you're saying?
Yes. Like I see multiple patients a shift who come in with opioid intoxication overdose, who when I first see them, they are very, very somnolent. You're not able to talk to them very much. And then they have a period where they're more awake, and almost all of them, if you ask them, what are your goals? They will tell you they want to enter recovery. But then at some point, if they start entering severe withdrawal, understandably, they experience this overwhelming urge to go and use again. But in those moments when patients say to me, I would love to talk to the addiction source, I'd love to enter recovery. Right now, we don't have much to offer them. Despite all the investment, there aren't available spaces. And I would give 4 of my fingers for like a ability to say to those people, here's a taxi, there's this place, there's a bed for you, go and find Darren at that place, tell him Quentin sent you, and they will get to know you, invest in your recovery, and have resources to give you a bed, to offer you the medical care you need in the context of whole person care. That's my dream.
Okay. Awesome. Anything else you want to say? Anything I should have asked you, or any final thoughts for our listeners and viewers?
No, I'm very grateful. There's, as you can tell, so much more to say about this issue, and the last thing I would say is that they're persons. And those patients you see, if you drive down Hastings Street or any community that's marked by addiction, any stories you read about addictive behavior that seems extreme or bizarre, that person is a person. They're like you. They have the same nature as you. They deeply want the same things that you want. And just like for you, there's hope for them. But they need friendship and belonging and love.
Fantastic. Thank you for this conversation. Merry Christmas to you and to everyone who's watching and listening. Show us that T-shirt one more time.
Here we go. Yeah, it's my
stretching out here.
We got a flower, some skulls. But no, thanks for having me. It's been great.
Yeah. We come out with these episodes about every 14 days. We'll be on a little bit of a longer break over Christmas, and then be back with some new episodes in January. We cover a broad range of topics, sometimes more philosophical. Sometimes I talk to authors of books I'm reading. Other times we get into the real nitty-gritty of Canadian politics. So if you like this conversation, subscribe to Resuming Debate wherever you get your podcasts, and listen to the rich diversity of episodes we have relating to contemporary issues, but going a little bit deeper into them than we're often able to in the more constrained time parameters that we have in the House of Commons or in committees. Please leave a review wherever you get your podcasts and help us get the word out. Thanks, everyone. Merry Christmas, and we'll see you in 2025.